and record the webinar. So good afternoon. Welcome to the IPA Power Hour webinar on net metering updates and implications for distributed generation in Illinois. My name is Megha Hamal. I am the communications manager for the webinar for the Illinois Power Agency, and I will be managing the webinar today. To get started, let's go over some housekeeping items. To reduce any background noise, all participants are muted upon entry. We have also enabled the live transcript button. If you wish to hide the live transcript button, simply click on the live transcript button and at the bottom and then hide subtitle. Please feel free to submit any questions anytime during the webinar. We will reserve some time towards the end to go over those questions. Today's session is being recorded. A recorded version of this session will be available on the IPA website under About IPA and Events. Attorneys that are attending this webinar for continuing legal education, we sent the course material this morning, so hopefully you have access to that presentation. But if you don't, we have also provided a link in the chat window where you can access the course material. So just a couple of points I want to emphasize. Again, this webinar is for general education and continuing legal education purposes. Nothing that we are presenting in this webinar is necessarily the position of the IPA or the Environmental Law and Policy Center, who's presenting at today's webinar. And we will not be answering any questions about the 2022 long-term plan that is currently with the Illinois Commerce Commission. And lastly, we will be sending a quick feedback survey towards the end of the webinar. And those that are attending this webinar for continuing legal education, please make sure to fill out the survey within a certain time frame. The deadline would be about 2 weeks so that we can provide you with the CLE credits. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers for this session. Our presenters for this session are Kelly Turner, Deputy Legal Counsel at the Illinois Power Agency, and Brad Klein, Senior Attorney at the Environmental Law and Policy Center. Environmental Law and Policy Center is a Midwest-based nonprofit environmental and advocacy group with offices across the U.S. Environmental Law and Policy Center's mission is to advance environmental progress and economic development together throughout the Midwest through projects that advance clean energy, clean air, clean water, and clean transportation. Thank you both for joining the webinar today. As I mentioned, after the presentation, we will take questions from participants. If you do have any questions, please feel free to drop those questions in the chat window. And here's a quick agenda on how we will present this webinar today. We'll provide an introduction to the IPA Power Hour webinars. Then Kelly will go over quick overview on net metering, background on net metering in Illinois, what Illinois net metering looks like today. And Brad will talk about a landscape overview of state net metering policies, how net metering is evolving. He will also review some case studies from the region, and then talk about Illinois transition to value-based DG compensation. And then we will conclude the webinar with Q&A. So just a quick overview on the IPA Power Hour webinars. Those that are new to the webinar today, just a quick introduction what Power Hour is about. It is a series of educational and informative presentations on a wide range of clean energy topics and emerging issues. Today's Power Hour, we will again provide a quick overview on net metering, how the net metering is evolving, look at some state policies, and look at some case studies as well. Again, this webinar is intended for general education and continuing legal education. So we will not be answering any questions about the long-term plan, draft long-term plan proposal that the agency made and is currently with the ICC. The future Power Hour webinars will cover other topics related to clean energy economy in Illinois. So here's a list of upcoming webinars. The next one, which is taking place on Friday, May 27th, will be on green hydrogen, exploring pathways to decarbonization. And you can look at the other two webinars that we are also presenting. So if you have not registered for any of these webinars, please feel free to go to the link that we have provided at the bottom to register for the webinar. So a quick overview on the Illinois Power Agency. We are an independent state agency created in 2007. Our duties include developing and implementing procurement plans for default customers of investor-owned utilities in Illinois. We are also responsible for developing and implementing other renewable energy programs. And we are also responsible for implementing the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which is a public policy designed to increase the renewables in Illinois. Under the Illinois RPS, we are responsible for developing the long-term plan. We conduct competitive procurements for utility scale projects, and we manage incentive programs that are designed to increase renewables, solar energy in Illinois, specifically for community solar and solar for homes and businesses. So with that, I would like to pass the presentation to Kelly.
Great, thank you, Mega, for that introduction. I appreciate it. I'm going to go off a video during the presentation so that everyone can focus on the slides, and also I'm having some bandwidth issues today. I'm going to move right into our slides here, and we're going to begin with an overview on net metering. So because these webinars have a very broad audience and you all may be joining with different levels of background on net metering or on renewable resources and how they work, I have included at the outset this diagram, which was put together by the Vermont Public Utility Commission to kind of illustrate the concept of what we're going to be talking about today. So this diagram shows a photovoltaic system on a home that is participating in net metering. And as we will discuss later, the system works the same way for other self-generating power sources. So if a customer has a small wind generating system behind the meter, it would work the same way. On this diagram, you can see the solar panels transform energy from the sun into electricity, which is then sent to an inverter that's on the system. And that inverter converts the direct current electricity that's generated at the panels into alternating current, which is what is used in your home. A bi-directional utility meter is installed on this home, which is capable of measuring both the energy that is drawn off of the distribution system of the utility into the house for use, as well as the excess energy that's generated by the solar panels on the roof and flows back to the utility grid. As you all know, we cannot control when the sun shines or when the wind blows, so therefore renewables are not always generating electricity when the host of that system needs the energy. Sometimes the system generates energy when the host of the system needs none. Sometimes they generate energy when it's needed. So when you have a power generation plant, it's selling the power that they produce to the grid at a wholesale price based on the demand of that location at the time. This is a vast oversimplification of how that works. But that rate feeds into the rate that utility customers pay for their power. When that utility customer, though, is generating their own energy and they're generating more energy than they can use and they send it out to the grid, how do we compensate them for that energy production? So Mega, if you can go to the next slide. The solution that we have to that question is net metering. Sometimes it's called net energy metering, but net metering policies have been used by states to assist and stimulate the adoption of renewable resources by allowing those renewables to essentially generate energy whenever the sun is shining or whenever the wind is blowing, and the system owner can receive compensation for that energy regardless of when it is generated. So in net metering, I saw some things online where people may have been confused that it involves the internet. It does not. It measures the energy supplied from the customer's self-generated system, their rooftop solar, for example, and it nets that out of the customer's gross energy consumption. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about net energy metering. The customer is then able to receive a credit for their excess generation produced by their system on their utility bill. So in Illinois, residential customers, small commercial customers with behind the meter generation, like we saw in the diagram on the last slide, receive net metering credits on a per kilowatt hour basis at the retail rate of their electricity, the same rate that their utility charges them for the electricity that they receive from the grid. Next slide, please. So net metering policies help to compensate the customer for their self-generated electricity. The way that they do this is we have credits that go onto the customer's bill on a monthly basis. And then excess credits can also be rolled over into future months. So this is important because, as all of you who are recently emerging from the Chicago winter know, we do not get an equal amount of sunshine each day of the year. We do not get an equal amount of wind each day in the year. So through net metering, customers can roll over their credits of excess generation when the renewable resource is abundantly available, and use those credits in future months when perhaps their system is underproducing. This allows for a renewable system to be designed to offset a customer's annual load. So a solar system can overproduce in the summer when the sun is shining a lot. And then those credits can be used in the winter to offset the customer's usage at that time when their system is not producing as much electricity as the customer needs at the time. The rolled over credits expire annually, so a customer cannot roll over their excess generation from one year to the next year, but they still potentially can offset a full year of their load depending on the system design and the actual availability of the renewable resource during that year. Despite the fact that a customer maybe doesn't need their excess energy at the time, and perhaps even the utility grid does not need the excess energy at the time that the system generates it, net metering ensures that the self-generator is compensated at a consistent level, which helps drive customer investment in renewable systems. Next slide, please. Again, for those of you who may be joining this presentation not knowing a lot about net metering or about utilities, I wanted to provide some very basic background here. In Illinois, net metering is made possible under provisions of the Public Utilities Act. I've included the statutory reference here. Among many things, the Public Utilities Act governs all regulated utility rates and charges. So regulated utilities are required to file what are called tariffs with the Illinois Commerce Commission for approval of their rates and charges. Utility tariffs, which allow for customers to take part in net metering service, are required to conform to the provisions of Section 16-107.5 of the Public Utilities Act, and they are subject to approval by the Commerce Commission. Commonwealth Edison, Ameren, Illinois, and Mid-American Energy Company each have their own commission-approved net metering tariffs that set forth how the credits will be applied to the bill and calculated. Next slide, please. I'm going to speak briefly on the history of net metering in Illinois and a bit about how it has evolved into what we have for net metering today. Next slide. So Public Act 95-420, enacted in 2007, established Section 16-107.5 of the Public Utilities Act. In creating this provision, the General Assembly stated that it was necessary to develop a program to provide net electricity metering. It can encourage private investment in renewable energy resources, stimulate economic growth, enhance the continued diversification of the Illinois energy resource mix, and protect the Illinois environment. So under the original iteration of this section of the PUA, the electricity provider was required to provide net metering at a rate identical to the rate structure and the retail rate components for excess generation in a monthly billing period. They were required to allow those credits to carry over and expire at the end of an annual period. And it limited the availability to take net metering or dual crediting services for larger customers, which I'm not going to touch on very much today, to systems that do not have more than 2 megawatts of generation on the customer side of the meter. These provisions together allowed customers to receive essentially one-to-one crediting on their monthly bills for excess generation on the residential systems. The tariffs under this section would calculate what the net energy was, what the net excess energy was produced by the customer system. And on a monthly basis, customers would receive those credits on their bills for the most part on a per kilowatt hour basis. Next slide, please. So Illinois next saw changes to its net metering provisions in 2011 with the modification of 16-107.5. There was an expansion of the types of renewable generating facilities which could be built behind the meter, allowing a customer to take net metering services. And notably, the changes here started to look towards what is becoming more and more common today, which is community solar subscriptions. And it provided that it allowed electricity providers to consider whether to allow aggregation for the purposes of net metering on a community-owned renewable project. So utilities were not required to offer this service, but we're kind of beginning here to see the changes that would allow for a group of customers to utilize the benefits of an off-site community renewable generation project. Next slide, please. Okay, in December of 2016, the Illinois General Assembly passed the what is colloquially known as the Future Energy Jobs Act, Public Act 990906, which became effective on June 1st of 2017. So changes to 16-107.5L of the Public Utilities Act required net metering be made available for community solar subscribers at the subscriber's energy supply rate equal to the subscriber's share of the production of electricity. And I apologize, I had left this off of my notes on a previous page. Beginning with the changes in law in 2011, the utility providers were required to provide net metering to eligible customers until the load of net metering customers equaled 5% of the total peak demand supplied by that electricity provider during the previous year. Originally, under the first iteration of the statute that had been 1%, in 2011, it was increased to 5%. This is also something that is continuing to change kind of as we're moving forward in the progression of net metering statutes in Illinois, as you'll see as I continue on here. So Fija changed the trigger and customers that would begin taking net metering from an electricity supplier after they reach that 5% would then only be able to receive net metering for the netting of their energy supply rather than the full retail rates of net metering. Next slide, please. Other changes under Fija, this doesn't directly tie into net metering, but it does tie into what Brad is going to be talking about later on. There was a creation of a distributed generation rebate under 16-107.6 of the Public Utilities Act. This rebate would be $250 until the net metering customer generating capacity reached 5%, that 5% threshold that we talked about on the last slide, at which point in time a successor rebate would go into effect. And that successor rebate would be developed through a proceeding and investigation at the Illinois Commerce Commission once the total generating capacity of that utility service territory reached 3%. And then at that 5% threshold, again, customers would no longer receive retail rate net metering, but could obtain the DG rebate and the supply netting. Next slide, please. So as many of you are likely aware, last fall, we saw the enactment of significant omnibus energy legislation in Illinois, Public Act 102-0662, which is known as the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, or Fija. One of the changes of Fija was actually changing the goals of the net metering statute. In addition to the goals that were originally set forth by the General Assembly in 2007, when they created net metering, the General Assembly also recognized that to achieve the goals of this act, that robust options for customer-side distributed generation continue to thrive in Illinois. The General Assembly finds that a predictable transition must be ensured for customers between full net metering at the retail electricity rate, which is what we have right now in Illinois, to the distributed generation rebate, which is described in section 16-107.6. Next slide, please. So the changes to 107.5 and 107.6 are work in concert together to remove the 5% threshold and instead establish a deadline of I'm sorry, that says January. It should say December 31st, 2024, for the end of retail rate net metering for new customers. And customers who are already on net metering by that date will continue to receive retail rate net metering through the life of their system, while customers who apply for net metering on or after January 1st, 2025 will receive net metering credits at the supply charge, and they will also be eligible for the DG rebate that was under section 16-107.6 of the Public Utilities Act. That section was largely rewritten under Fija, and I know that that's something that Brad's going to talk about later on. So I've not discussed those changes here in my slides. Next slide, please. So what does Illinois net metering look like today? Next slide, please. If a customer were to install an eligible system behind the meter at their home, what would it look like? How could it qualify for net metering? So I've listed out here the various types of resources that are eligible. It's not just what we typically think of rooftop solar on your home. It also includes wind, dedicated crops grown for electricity generation, agricultural residues, a variety of other items. Any of these systems that are located behind the meter at the customer's location would be eligible for net metering. Community solar subscriptions are detailed within the net metering statute. Customers are able to receive credits from a community solar or another community generation resource within their service territory through a subscription to that system. For community solar subscriptions, Mega, I think can you flip to the next slide? Okay, I thought I had it on the next slide. I guess I don't. For community solar systems, customers are credited on a basis for their share in the system, and they receive credits on the supply portion of their bill. So 16107.5C outlines different net metering requirements for customers whose electricity is provided and measured on a kilowatt hour basis, and those who are provided and measured service on a kilowatt demand basis. I think I saw something in the chat where Brad was clarifying that earlier. If there are additional questions on that later on, we can get to those. But generally, residential, small commercial customers are billed on a per kilowatt hour basis, and so they see their credits work in that way. Customers who are charged on a kilowatt hour basis whose generation exceeds the amount of electricity used by that customer over the billing period, over that 1 month period, receive a 1-to-1 credit on billing at the retail rate. And a similar regime governs demand-based charges. The tariffs are slightly different, and that's outlined in a different section of 16107.5. Next slide, please. So some customers receive are on a billing program where they pay hourly pricing or time of use rates. Those customers will receive credits for the excess generation during any hourly period or during any time of use period at the same price that the customer would pay during that period. So rather than looking at the customer's entire monthly charges, their monthly usage, and their monthly production, the credits are provided on the basis of looking at those hourly pricing periods and those time of use periods. And finally, with community solar subscriptions, subscribing customers, of course, obviously do not have the system behind their own meter, but they do receive their supply credits for the value of their subscription level on their bill. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to kick it over to Brad to get into net metering 2.0 and the evolution of DG compensation policies in Illinois and across the Midwest.
Brad? Brad, are you on mute?
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect, thank you.
Okay. Thanks, good. Okay, hi everybody, it's Brad Klein from ELPC. Thanks for having me on. My presentation is going to pick up from where Kelly left off and zoom out a little bit and talk about net metering in the sort of a broader political context, both nationally, and take a look at what's going on in some other Midwest states, and then zoom in again and describe how some of those considerations of the evolution of net metering are playing out in Illinois and what will happen in the future. Megan, next slide, please. So let's go to the next one, and I'll give an overview. This is a map that shows the current state of net metering policy across the country. And there is wide variation in specific state net metering programs in terms of the details, but the big picture here is that the vast majority of states do have some kind of net metering program. And the states in gray here all do have some variety of net metering for customers. Now, there are changes that are beginning to occur. And you can see that some states are in a transition from sort of traditional net metering, kind of the basic kind of net metering, to something different, something maybe more sophisticated. And Illinois is among those states. and there are some other Midwestern states that are in transition that I'll cover. But big picture here is that net metering policy is not static. Over the last 15 to 20 years, there's been a continual evolution that's been picking up speed in recent years, and we'll get into some of that next. Next slide. So with renewable energy policy, oftentimes California is a trendsetter, and with net metering, there's a lot of rooftop solar, and that has engendered quite a bit of dispute and policy fluctuation right now, and I think it's a little bit of a canary in a coal mine for what may be coming to other states as more and more rooftop solar proliferates. And I just wanted to highlight that the dispute in California centers around what are the costs of net metering and benefits of net metering, and how are those distributed through the policy. There was a very, very controversial proposed decision by an administrative law judge that was issued by the California PUC in December of 2021 that would have very radically reformed the current net metering regime in California. The proposal was to add a grid participation charge, basically a flat fee amounting to $8 per kilowatt of installed solar every month, and also significant changes to the credit rate for net metering customers in California. And some of those changes would have applied to existing net metering customers. So that created a real firestorm of controversy and pushback from customers and from the industry. And the governor weighed in on this, and Arnold Schwarzenegger weighed in on it in an op-ed in the New York Times, and it was a pretty significant kind of newsworthy event for something as obscure as net metering policy. And the upshot of that is that the California PUC withdrew that proposed decision in February, and there has been no further notice of what's going to happen next. But definitely still an unsettled policy environment about how net metering will reform in California, and frequently, as goes California around clean energy policy, other states tend to follow at some point. So next slide, please. So what's the debate about there? At its core, it sort of boils down to trying to balance the costs and benefits of rooftop solar and trying to identify a policy that sort of fairly allocates those costs and benefits while also continuing to provide certainty for the solar industry to scale and to ensure that we're transitioning to clean energy in ways that meet our broader climate change and other societal goals. So this is a diagram. You don't have to kind of get into the details of this so much to see that at least by one of the consultants in the California debate, they're putting in the bill savings that individual customers receive through net metering policy and kind of characterizing those as a cost of the program, a utility's lost revenue due to providing bill credits to net metering customers. At least this consultant was considering that that money had to be collected from somewhere, and that should be classified as a cost. I should say that I don't subscribe to this kind of view of net metering, but it's important to understand that this is part of the debate. Balanced against those program costs, you have a whole stack of benefits that come from rooftop solar. And you can see some of the avoided distribution and transmission and energy costs, things that go into that stack. And there's a whole host of differences of opinion about what belongs in that benefit stack and how you measure those and quantify them. So that's part of the debate that goes on within PUCs and among advocacy groups to try to assess net metering policy and evolve over time to something that will govern going forward. Next slide, please. I wanted to point out that one of our neighbors in the Midwest in Minnesota actually was a real leader in trying to think through methodologies for characterizing the value of rooftop solar. And this is a pretty old slide. I think it's from 2014 or 2015. But it shows how the Minnesota PUC was thinking about quantifying value for different attributes of avoided costs that are part of the value of rooftop solar. And you know, you note here that they included an environmental cost, and some other jurisdictions include sort of other social costs and social benefits. And I think that, you know, particularly as we're thinking about the future, there's certainly a resilience benefit to a more decentralized energy infrastructure as well that probably does belong in this kind of stack. But this is just a good illustration of the concept of balancing costs and benefits. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to cover a few different current events in the Midwest where some of these debates are playing out. And next slide, we'll jump right in. So I've chosen to cover 3 states that have all handled this net metering transition somewhat differently. And I should mention, though, that these aren't the only Midwest states that are considering changes to net metering. There is a docket open in Wisconsin right now, and certainly we'll cover Illinois in depth later. But in Indiana, there was legislation that passed in 2017 that created a transition towards a less favorable compensation regime for net metering. That law passed over significant opposition from clean energy and environmental and other stakeholder groups, but it did pass, and it directed the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission to develop a new tariff for DG compensation once each utility reached a specific DG threshold. One of the utilities in Indiana has, the first utility to meet that was Vectren, which was a utility in Southern Illinois. It's been purchased by CenterPoint Energy. And the IURC approved a proposal from Vectren that significantly reduced the value of net metering. And that created a dispute among other stakeholder groups that has been litigated through the court. ELPC was involved along with a lot of other colleagues in that case. And the Indiana Court of Appeals actually struck down the commission's ruling approving Vectren's tariff for various reasons. And the utility then appealed to the Indiana Supreme Court. It's likely, I would say, that the Supreme Court will take this up. And so we have this sort of legislate and litigate approach where there's still quite a bit of uncertainty around the market, and it's going to get hashed out in the courts. Moving to Iowa, there was a similar legislative debate in Iowa where Mid-American, which is Iowa's largest utility, had sort of sponsored legislation that would have added a similar rooftop solar fee on net metering customers' bills. It was kind of similar to what the California PUC proposed decision looked like. Opponents of that legislation characterized it as taxing the sun. There was a vigorous debate in the State House. Some interesting sort of different stakeholders, the Iowa pork producers and some other agriculture groups joined with the environmental groups and the solar industry in successfully pushing back that legislation. And ultimately, the different stakeholders were able to compromise on a policy that preserved the existing net metering regime through a 5% DG threshold, and then directed the Iowa Utility Board to investigate the value of solar and replace net metering eventually with a value of solar tariff. So that's a different approach. It was one in which legislative compromise was reached, which created stability in the industry and sort of a clear path forward. And I'll close with just touching on Michigan, which also adopted new legislation that eliminated retail net metering and replaced it with what's called a DG tariff that uses an inflow-outflow regime. The details of that are set by the Michigan Public Service Commission. And what an inflow-outflow regime means is that DG customers pay the retail rate for electricity that they purchase from the grid and inflows to the customer's premises, and they pay a separate rate. They're compensated at a different rate, a separate rate for energy that's exported back to the grid. And the actual amounts of that inflow and outflow compensation are litigated in every utility rate case. So there is sort of uncertainty around what those numbers are and a little bit less stability for DG policy in Michigan. And, much more to come there. I think there's been continuing efforts at passing legislation that would create more certainty going forward. Next slide. So I'll kind of spin through this quickly because Kelly covered some of this and just mentioned that, both the Future Energy Jobs Act and the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act significantly amended net metering. And I would say that the main thrust of the Fija legislation was to create more stability. And one thing that is very significant is a new distribution grid planning process, which will create more transparency around distribution planning in Illinois. And there is a very specific interaction between the grid planning process and the development of compensation for distributed generation going forward. And we'll talk about that on some subsequent slides. Next slide, please. A couple other high points of the changes from Fija. We no longer have a system size cap for net metering. And also the threshold for sizing an on-site system can be based on what the customer expects for its future energy requirements. And this is important in the context of increasing electrification. Systems can be sized kind of taking into consideration, future purchases of electric vehicles or, heat pumps or home electrification. Kelly mentioned the predictable transition that replaced the former program cap that was based on a percentage of DG penetration with a specific date. That was very important. And the safe harbor or grandfathering for net metering customers and community solar bill crediting. Let's move on to the next slide. So the DT rebate, this is one worth digging into a little bit. The main idea here is that the legislature is creating a new program, which is at section 16107.6 of the Public Utilities Act, that is intended to move us to a compensation regime for distributed resources that's based on the value that those resources can provide to the grid and by extension to all other customers. Ways that you can use rooftop solar and associated energy storage or your electric vehicle or efficiency technologies, other things to actually create a more efficient grid, potentially, if aggregated together, replace some kind of traditional utility grid infrastructure. Like instead of building a new substation, for example, perhaps the utility could rely in part on some customer-owned DERs, which would save money, and also creating more of a transactive market for DER services, things like voltage regulation or other ways in which customer-owned resources can be a good actor on the grid and provide grid services. This is a really rich and complicated field. There's a lot of study of this right now, but the Illinois legislature has put us on the path to move in that direction and charge the Illinois Commerce Commission with trying to implement this over time. And so in the meantime, this slide shows, the legislature set a trigger date for moving to a more robust DER value compensation regime after 2025. But in the meantime, they took some interim steps. And this slide shows like what are the interim steps and what's available now as the ICC will eventually move us further down the line to a more sophisticated program. So, so basically this provides the option for customers to select receiving a rebate if they install a system that has a smart inverter at these value levels. You'll see there's different values assigned for non-residential customers and residential customers. If the customer selects this option of receiving the rebate, then they move to a different kind of net metering. They no longer receive full retail rate net metering. Instead, they receive net metering of their kilowatt hour supply charges, and no longer the kilowatt hour based delivery charges. So that's an option, and it's something customers should work out with their installers because the ICC is reviewing the utilities' proposed DG tariffs as we speak, and there should be final orders coming later this year, which will create these new options for customers. Next slide. After 2025, one slide back. There we go. So in the meantime, as we're in this interim period, the statute also requires the ICC to open up an investigation into the value of DERs. And they're directed to open that by June 30th, 2023. That's going to be a super interesting proceeding for energy nerds like me and many on this call, I'm sure, to get into it and really try to figure out how DERs can provide value on the Illinois distribution grid. The ICC is required to look to the utility's new integrated grid plans to help identify that value. Those integrated grid plans are going to be filed in January of 2023, and they're going to be also a very important proceeding at the ICC to review those grid plans. There are some guardrails on this process. There are some sort of baseline or minimum floor prices that will continue to be available regardless of the outcome of that investigation. And that's intended to provide stability to the market so the bottom doesn't drop out. And you can see that that's at a minimum of $250 per kilowatt base rebate. There's also a requirement to look at, location-based or time and performance-based variables that can be added onto that base rebate. And that's, I think, where things get really interesting. Are there particular places on the grid where DERs can provide even more value? And if so, how should the utility sort of go out there into the market and try to make offers to spur the development of those resources and then deploy them to provide grid services? So stay tuned and pay attention to what's going on at the ICC because a lot to come in the next few years. Next slide. And I'll just leave folks with, I think, an important growing realization that decentralized local solar and storage, whether it's community solar or rooftop solar, some of these smaller resources located in the distribution grid, there's a growing recognition of the high value that those kinds of resources provide to the system. Optimizing the system to include both large-scale solar and wind resources, but also a large amount of local resources will be the most efficient way to reach our clean energy goals. And there's some new modeling that demonstrates that, and I'd encourage folks, if they're interested in this topic, to take a look at the Vibrant Clean Energy Modeling. I've linked it here to see those real clear benefits. And with that, I'll close the presentation and we can move to questions.
Thank you, Brad. Thanks, Kelly, for such a great presentation. And it looks like we got tons of questions, and Kelly has already answered some of those questions. So I'll just address the questions that have not been answered. And again, we want to be mindful of everyone's time, so we may not be able to get to all the questions, but we'll try our best. So the first question is, net metering credits may be used for power purchases and deliveries, not account maintenance monthly fees, correct?
If I understood the question, oh, go ahead, Kelly.
I was going to say that I'm not sure that I understood the question exactly. And so I didn't see that one in the chat, but Brad, go ahead.
Yeah, I think my understanding was a question about whether monthly fees could be netted. I mean, the basic net metering requirements allow for netting of kilowatt-hour based charges. So to the extent that there are fees that are assessed on a kilowatt-hour basis, those would be rolled into those would be netted. But if there's taxes or fees that are flat fees or your monthly charge, that is not netted.
Thank you, Brad. The next question is, does the value of net metering credits change depending on whether the inverter rebate offered by investor-owned utilities is monetized?
The answer to that is yes, and that question refers to the transition period we're in right now, in which residential customers will have the option to either select a full retail rate net metering, or instead select the DG Smart Inverter Rebate. If customers choose to select the DG Rebate, then they'll no longer be eligible for the netting of delivery service credits, the kilowatt-hour based delivery service credits. So the value of the credits will go down. You will still be eligible to net the supply-based credits on your bill and take the DG rebate. So that's going to be an option that customers will just have to pencil it out and with both of those options and decide what's best for them.
Thanks. The next question is on the grandfathering. So the question says, how does the grandfathering apply to municipal electric utility net metering?
It doesn't.
Yeah. I was going to say, Brad kind of answered this a little bit. So the municipal net metering provisions are different. And so that's why it doesn't apply to net metering in municipal service territories, municipal utility territories.
Got it. Thank you. Are the credits that customers of a community solar project in the form of kilowatt hours or actual dollars, and how is that determined? I'm not understanding this question, but maybe you both do.
Yeah, so the credits that are given to customers, to residential and small commercial customers, are on a per kilowatt hour basis. I think that answers the question. It's a credit on a kilowatt hour basis. It's not a cash credit to customers.
Got it. The next question is, for commercial community solar generation anchor subscribers, is the community solar generation valued at their supply rate, and then the community solar generation gives a discount off of that?
The way that crediting works for community solar subscribers is that they subscribe to a certain portion of the production of the system. So an anchor tenant will have between 10% and 40% of the production of that system. And then on a monthly basis, they'll receive a supply credit for that portion of their production in that month.
And I'll just add one thing to that, which is that Fija changed the formula for the supply-based credits on bills. Under the prior statute, that supply credit only included the energy charges on the bill. Fija expanded that to also include transmission and capacity charges. That increases the value of the supply-based credit for net metering in Illinois going forward.
Great. The next question is, if value of solar included avoided environmental cost, would that conflict with language in SREC contracts preventing double counting of green value? Would it put SREC customers in breach of contract?
Those are the kinds of like weedy details that have to be determined by commissions in every state when these policies are developed. So it's a good question, and it is one that states have come out with differently and have to be nuanced around to make sure that SREC contracts are remain valid.
Sure. The next question is the eventual DG rebate intended to be provided in addition to SRECs or instead of SRECs?
So I want to make clear that net metering is a separate kind of essentially incentive structure. It's not a paid incentive, right? But it is a policy that incents customers to develop renewable generation behind the meter. Currently, customers can take a DG rebate if they would like to do so, and it doesn't affect their ability to obtain a REC contract under the IPA's programs here in Illinois. Additionally, the REC pricing model that the IPA has in place currently for our REC contracts do account for net metering credits and also DG rebate credits where we think that systems would avail themselves of those credits and rebates.
Okay. And there's one question, this probably is the last question. Is there any explicit prohibition or permission regarding net metering for battery storage or output to grid?
So one of the changes under Fija is that battery storage can be tied to a system that is eligible for net metering. You generally cannot store the energy on your battery and then send it back to the system, and then also, there's restrictions in place to prevent the kind of the double counting of that generation.
Got it. I think those are the only questions that we've received in the chat, but I want to confirm with Sarah. Sarah, have we received any new questions?
There are some new questions, but I wasn't sure how we were doing on timing. It is 1 o'clock.
Right, so maybe like a minute or two at most.
Okay. There's also been a question about whether we can share the chat. We're talking internally about how we would do that, so we will let everyone know. So another question that has just come in, and I'm not quite sure I understand it, but I will try. Will the change of net zero metering credit from time of day rate to kilowatt hour charged apply for commercial customers over 2 megawatts per installation? I'm not quite sure what net zero metering means, but.
I'm not sure that I understand the question either. I think that they're talking about if a customer who's on time of use rates has a net zero credit, would that also apply to customers over with a system over 2 megawatts? There are provisions for how.
Sorry, under 2 megawatts, they corrected it.
Okay.
But yeah.
All right, let me think. Will the change of net zero metering credit from time of day rate to kilowatts charged apply for commercial customers under 2 megawatts per installation? Yeah, I'm not sure that I understand the question, but customers who are billed on a per kilowatt hour charge that are on time of use rates will receive a credit for excess generation during the time of use period.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. We still have questions coming in, but I don't think we're gonna be able to get to all of them. So I'll try and see if we can share the chat somehow so that everyone can kind of keep those questions in mind. So that's it from the chat, Mega.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sarah. So thank you all for such an engaging session. We had a lot of people attending this session, almost more than 160. So that's great. So thank you on behalf of the IPA for attending this webinar. We hope it was educational, and thank you to our wonderful speakers for providing such information, such great information and insights into net metering. I want to, again, remind everyone about the next Power Hour webinar on green hydrogen. If you have not registered already, please do so by going onto the IPA website under About IPA and Events. So with that, this concludes the presentation for today, and have a great weekend. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.